Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stacy Scott, and I take care of the marketing and client relations here at Wickham Financial and Insurance Services, and I'll also be your host for today. Thank you so much for joining us today for this month's Lunch and Learn. Our firm focuses on leading with education, and last month we began a series of sessions addressing aspects of total wealth management, particularly risk management. And we talked about different strategies and products to consider when looking at your portfolio needs. Today, in our second session of this series, Graham is going to address what role disability insurance and long-term care insurance might play in your wealth management plan. As always, there's going to be a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So if at any point during the discussion you think of a question, please type it into the Q&A box on the webinar. And I'll make sure that Graham sees that question and can answer it for you. And just a reminder that Graham's calendar is going to pop up periodically throughout the session. And if you'd like to talk with Graham or anyone on the team, please feel free to choose the time and day that works best for you, and we'll make sure to get that on the calendar. And with all of that taken care of, Graham, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Hey, thank you, Stacy. Thank you to all who are on the call, who will be watching the call later. These are pretty important topics. I mean, what we're talking about is wealth management. So I want to take a moment and kind of go over that, because that's really a hallmark. It's our culture here. If you're a client, you know that. And when we think about proper planning, we're really talking about managing what's important to you, your financial lives, throughout your financial lives, right? So wealth management isn't just about individual stocks or funds or ETFs and what accounts to move from that. Important, but not the total package. So we're talking about the total package, and this is how we really feel you should be designing your financial lives to address all aspects of your needs throughout your lives. So in financial or wealth management, we think about 5 different steps. We have retirement planning, in not any certain order, retirement planning, investment planning, risk management strategies. We want to think about estate planning, how to pass on what's important to us to the ones and things we care about when we can and cannot make decisions. We want to think about tax strategy, how to keep more of what you worked hard for, right? As I often say, it's your legal obligation to pay less taxes. You want to avoid legally, never evade on taxes, right? We don't want to break ourselves into jail or get an audit or a fine, right? So now we're addressing 5 steps of wealth management. We're focusing again this week on risk management strategy. We usually get a lot of questions on this. You know, you hear about all these different products and when should I start them, when should I not? Stacy brought up, we're talking about disability insurance. We're talking about long-term care insurance. And what roles do they play within your wealth management plan, all right? So last week, we explored life insurance. We talked about annuities. Now we got down to some basics, right? So we're hitting a higher level under risk management, under those 5 steps of total wealth management. And we got into life insurance. What role could that play for you if you own a business, you have a partnership, you have a key employee, college cost, income needs? That's where life insurance can play a role. Or annuities, guarantee income, protect against loss, so on and so forth. So today, the last 2 that we're going to be covering is disability and long-term care. So below, you'll see a kind of a timeline. And the reason why I asked my team to kind of put this together is to maybe give you a visual. I love visuals. So when do you maybe think about certain types of insurance at certain stages of your life, right? So just basically, while you're employed, we're thinking pre-retirement here. You know, you've got your classic health insurance. You're probably under the plan with your employer. Maybe you have a private policy outside, either through the exchange, right, or a private insurance company. Then we think about disability. So disability is going to play a big role while you're employed. Why? Because think about disability insurance. What it's trying to do is replace a level of income you're earning when you can't be at work to earn that income. Makes sense, right? So when you're thinking about disability, we're going to think about two types. Workers' compensation, that comes into play if you're hurt on the job. Outside of that, you would have a standalone private policy. We'll get into disability a bit more here on a couple more slides. Now you're retired, 65 plus, but we're just using that range because that's when Medicare kicks in, and you would pick up Medicare A and B as your primary health coverage, maybe grab a medical supplement, right? So that's an additional policy that would pick up what A and B does not pick up. And then long-term care policy would probably play a bigger role at that particular time than it would when you're employed. And the biggest reason why, and we'll get into long-term care topics here in a minute, the reason why you're not trying to replace income when you're retired, right? What we're trying to do is have a quality of care that meets your goals and objectives. It also mitigates risk from financial loss for the spouse that might still be living at home, so on and so forth. And again, we'll go over the stuff in a bit more detail. So it doesn't mean that you go and get long-term care at 65. You might choose to go ahead and get a long-term care policy, somewhere in the range of 50, 55. What we always say about insurance, listen, you buy insurance before you need it, because it's going to be really hard to pick up these type of policies to mitigate against financial loss when a loss or an illness or so on and so forth is already occurring. They're not going to insure you during that time. So you get it before you need it, right? So if we look at breaking down these two sides, so let's start with disability insurance. Again, I know it's high level. We don't get too granular here, but we're happy to, as my calendar pops up, sit down with you and go in a lot more detail. But let's think about disability. So we're trying to replace an income if we're unable to work to generate the income to meet our expenses, right? So it's designed to replace a percentage of income when you can't work due to illness or injury. Now we can split that into two primary types, all right? So you might have your private insurance when you go get your own standalone policy. You might have a policy at work that is already a part of your employment package through HR. So you want to make sure you pull that out, you look at it, but to make sure it's going to cover what you need it to cover, all right? The other is going to be government insurance. So that's where maybe Social Security benefits would come in, all right? And we'll look at state and federal on that, but again, we're not going to get into the granular aspect of it. It's going to be kind of, just for this call, kind of staying a bit high level, all right? So if we look at private insurance, so private insurance, you're going out, I'm going to buy a disability insurance policy in the private market. Maybe it's under a group plan. How much should you have? I always get that question. Well, you got to think about how much income you need to replace, right? And you might underestimate. We always see an underestimation, right? Well, I just need, 3,000, 5,000. Well, what is that covering? Is that covering your basic expenses? But is that going to cover, food costs? Is it going to cover the gas costs? I mean, we all know that those have gone up. So you want to go back and look at those policies, make sure they're covering maybe for a little bit more than what you're thinking, all right? It's not just a mortgage. It's not just a power bill. We need to be thinking about the gas cost. We need to be thinking about maybe the grocery bill, so on and so forth. How much money can you afford to spend on those premiums, right? What's in your budget to pay for that? I'm not going to say disability insurance is high or low. We just need to quantify that for you, and you're going to have to qualify it for yourself. But you want to think about, what does your budget afford you to be able to do? We don't want you to be insurance rich and cash poor, but at the same time, we want you to buy a policy that's going to meet your needs and objectives, because after that disability happens, you're not going to be able to upgrade that distribution amount to replace the income. Then we're going to think about the insurance company, the quality of the company, how long the coverage is going to be out there, make sure that meets your needs. But also, many insurance companies are only going to cover maybe 2/3 of that income, maybe up to 50 to 70% of your gross income. That might be all they're going to insure. And those policies might be in place for 2 or 4 years, or towards 65. You just got to see the length. And each one of those is going to come at a different cost. So we can play around with when does it go into effect, right? Usually ranges between 30 to 365 days. Most common is about 90. Keep in mind, to qualify for disability, you have to show that it's not something you're going to have an immediate recovery on, right? Before they're going to pay out. So there's going to be an elimination period. So when you think about the elimination period, you can, jostle around with those numbers or play with those numbers a bit. And that's another way to keep those costs down. Maybe you self-insure for the first 60 days, 90 days, 180 days, whatever it might be for you outside of what the policy says it'll do, so you can keep your insurance costs down. You can also play with the benefit amount on that. If we think about the next type of disability coverage, now we're getting into the government insurance plan, or we're getting into Social Security disability benefit. And again, this is a couple pages long. I can add to the slide. We weren't going to do that to you today and go over in too much detail on that. But basically, it needs to be a disability that is going to continue and you're not necessarily looking to recover from in the short run, right? So it can also be a delay on when they're even going to consider. We see numbers like 5 months out there before they'll even consider covering you under disability benefits. Can be a much more arduous process to go through, and it has to be something that's not going to be recovered from in the shorter run. It's going to be in the longer run. All right. So now that we've covered some basics on disability, so while you're employed, you're looking to use it to replace the income that you would be receiving because you're not able to go back to work. If you're not hurt on the job, you're going to go with some standalone policies of the government Social Security program. If you're hurt on the job, you're probably going to come under the workers' compensation insurance policy under the company where you were injured at. All right. So let's jump into long-term care. I mean, this is really a topic of wealth management that, like disability, I have to admit, I think it's challenging. I think it's challenging for clients to wrap our minds around being disabled or needing care, even though the odds are extremely high. And we'll look at some statistics here in a minute that disability is going to happen either by choice or not. Right? And long-term care, the odds that you're going to need it are really, really high. I mean, how many of us do we know a family member, a loved one, maybe personally, where we had a disability that hampered our effectiveness on the job, or maybe couldn't go back to an employment, or we had a loved one or family member or yourself that fell into a long-term care situation where you're not recovering from some sort of illness or accident, and it's going to be something that needs to be need assistance with for an ongoing process. So let's dial in on long-term care here. Long-term care refers to the ongoing service and support needed by a person who has chronic health conditions or disabilities. And I think the key is chronic health conditions. You're not recovering from this, right? There are 3 levels of health care. Right. So I think a lot of times, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I just feel like I hear this over the last 30 years being in business, that, it's a nursing home. It's a nursing home. Not necessarily. What if you just need some sort of skilled care? Okay. That might be round the clock. That's pretty intense. It might be in a nursing facility. All right. Like a full care facility. What about an intermediate care? All right. Maybe it's more of an assisted living type approach. Or it could be in a custodial care environment. Maybe it's something at home and you have a family caregiver. Maybe it's a nurse, another outside caregiver coming in, making sure that you dress, you eat, you can bathe, you can do some of the basics. And it's not that you couldn't do yourself, but maybe you need someone to be there just in case something happens. There was an older couple that we worked with years ago. And I always give this example out, is that it's not always that they can't care for themselves. It might be because of the caregiver, family member in this situation. It's an older couple. She was, frail and petite, and he was a larger elderly gentleman. She couldn't really help him up off the toilet or bathing. Dressing could be an issue, but wasn't that he couldn't. It was the idea or the possibility that an accident could happen or happen to her trying to lift him up or help him out with some of those cares or those needs that he needed. So when we're thinking about long-term care, let's dive in here. We look at long-term care as is not just providing nursing home, as I mentioned. The most common type of long-term care is in-home. I mean, wouldn't we want to be at our home than at a facility, ideally in the comfort of our home? Long-term care services may also be provided at an assisting living or a daycare center, all right? So it could be the spouse or a family member can go to work. Maybe it's a daycare type facility just to watch, since you can't be home to watch them, right? Now, if we look at some statistics, now this might be a little disturbing, but we got to think it through, right? The odds of needs of long-term care are high. Approximately 52% of people will need long-term care at some point during their lifetimes after reaching 65. And approximately 8%, I think this is an incredible number, 8% between 40 and 50 will have a disability that may require some long-term care services. Now, I gave the example of the elderly couple a minute ago, but let's not say elderly. Let's say in the mid to late 50s, just about to hit 60 years old. That couple was late 70s, 80s. All right. So this couple was actually family members. And basically, my aunt in the situation had a stroke. And the stroke, you know, she needed care. They wanted to care for her at home. She was paralyzed in a portion of one side of her body. Now, my uncle was very active. He was a very big golfer. She still wanted him to be able to get out and about. He needed to get out and just clear his mind, because it wasn't as much as he wanted to be there every waking moment for her. He had to stay strong, right? So he needed to get out and do some things that he enjoyed doing. He just needed to go out and go shopping. He needed to get out and about just to clear his mind. And you know what? In that situation, they used a caregiver for a certain amount of hours during the day so he could get out and about. She could also have someone in the house and not just him there all the time. So there's so many different ways to think about how you would use long-term care. And let's be mindful of this. Are you going to pay for this cost out of your pocket? Could you pay for some of it out of your pocket? Are you going to rely on a family member, a loved one, to help cover this cost? Is that a burden that you would want to place on someone? So here, let's talk about the care and what the cost could be. So if we're thinking about a semi-private room, just a semi-private room on a national average, we're looking at roughly around $7,700 a month. That can equate to over $93,000 a year. If we need a private room, we want a private room, we don't want to share it, we're looking at a national average of $105,000 a year. That's $8,800 on a monthly basis. Think about that over 10 years. I mean, we're talking $1 million+ just for one individual. What if the other spouse or partner needs to go into a care facility or need care? Let's start extrapolating those costs out. It can really add up quick. And if we think about an assisted living, so you can still care for yourself to a large degree, we're still looking at $4,300 a month. And in-home, ideally, you know, maybe cost could be a little less. It depends on how much they need to be at home to care. But on average, about $1,600 on a monthly basis. Any way you slice this adds up over time, right? And we got to think about our estate, right? Every one of us has an estate, and I'm not putting a dollar sign on it, but you have a wish and a will how you want your estate distributed. You might want to preserve that estate so it's as whole as possible to pass it on to the children, the grandchildren. Maybe there's a house in the family, right, that was passed down. Wouldn't that be horrible to think that maybe you had to sacrifice that for your own care, and it couldn't be passed down to the next generation so they can enjoy it, create their own memories. So if you think about it, it can be more than just the cost out of your pocket. It might be something that's within the family that you might have to liquidate to cover this care. All right. So continuing with long-term care, let's think about what are what are the benefits, all right? So what are you trying to do with long-term care? And I think it's really important that we really take our time, like we do in our retirement classes, take the time to kind of close our eyes a little bit, sit back, and just envision or imagine, right? When I said retirement, what your retirement would look like. You know, does your partner agree with that? Are y'all on the same page? I don't think that's necessarily that far off when we think about long-term care, right? It might not be as pleasurable, but we want to make sure that we're mitigating financial loss, right? We don't want to sacrifice that family home I mentioned that was passed down, or the partner's or spouse's home or lifestyle if we need care, right? You're less dependent on family and friends and the stress. You know, they have their own lives, they got kids. You know, they're there to help you, they want to be there. But what stress, burden, financially or emotionally, would you be placing on them if you didn't have the assets, the insurance coverage, whatever it might be, to mitigate that cost? You know, again, we want to preserve that estate and just good old-fashioned options. You know, it's great that we have state-funded facilities, but I think if any of us who have experienced a state-funded facility, if we had options, I think we would probably choose maybe a different location, right? Possibly. And again, that's no offense to the state-funded facilities. It's fantastic that they're here. But I think we want to create an environment that's going to be as comfortable as possible, you know, warm and welcoming, and it might come at a higher cost. So we want to make sure we have that available. Again, my calendar's popping up a lot down below. Click on it. I'm happy to go into any details on any of these topics that we cover today or anything else. I'm happy to sit down with you. Go ahead and hit that calendar, sign up, and we'll cover whatever you need covered. But if we think long-term care insurance can be expensive, right? So the cost depends primarily on your age, but also on the benefits that you're choosing. All right. So do you want to self-insure a bit, right? Or do we want to buy a Cadillac policy, if you might, that covers absolutely everything that we can think about? Are we going to put an inflation rider in there, right? So when we think about now designing the policy to meet our needs, we're kind of thinking about what we talked about a little bit with disability. So on the long-term care, here we could play with the daily benefit that's paid out, generally $50 to $300, $350 a day. Maybe we start out a little bit lower on the benefit, but we put an inflation rider on there, so the benefit can grow over time with inflation, and we know the impact that inflation can play on our lives right now, right? We're going through it. We want to think about when it starts, right? Can we self-insure maybe for the first 30, 60, 90, 120 days before it starts? We self-insure a little bit. And maybe we just, again, don't buy the Cadillac plan. Maybe we buy a portion of what we need and we self-insure for the other. Then how long will the policy cover? I mean, it's getting really challenging to really find policies that will cover over 4 years, right? So the 4-year average stay in a nursing home facility, the average stay in a nursing home facility is 4 years, right? So 2 to 4 years, maybe it's a lifetime, maybe it's what's called a pooled benefit that each spouse could pull from. One doesn't need it. There's a pool there, a pot of money, if you might, that can be used for the spouse who does need that type of care, right? And then we got to decide what type of facility, where we want to be, where we're going to be comfortable, and what's the cost associated to be in that facility. So there's a good bit of things that you want to think about here. But the biggest thing is you have to lose ADLs before long-term care insurance would kick in. That doesn't negate the need of long-term care. All right. So loss of 2 ADLs, activities of daily living, usually is required before a long-term care policy or some benefit from long-term care can go into place. And then there would be a time period in between. So that kind of, I know it's a bit high level on both disability and long-term care insurance, but I did want to leave some extra time for Q&A because it usually is always some good questions when we cover these topics.
Yes, actually, Graham, we have gotten a couple of questions in. The first one is, when should I buy long-term care or disability?
Mm-hmm. you know, and I'm not saying this flippant, you really got to buy it before you need it, right? Because it's going to be pretty much impossible afterwards. But think about this, you know, disability is going to come in line, like I mentioned before, while you're employed, right? We're trying to replace that income stream. You can't be in work, you can't earn the paycheck. That's when disability is going to come. Generally, long-term care is going to play a role when you're not working, right? So maybe you're retired, or it could just be a standalone policy while you're 50 or 55 is a good starting range, maybe 55, again, just before the care is needed. And you're still working, you still have disability. So it doesn't mean disability or work hinges on if you get long-term care, but that might be a way to think about it. Disability, definitely why you need a paycheck. When you don't need the paycheck and now you're getting distributions from pensions, Social Security, you have other investments in place to supplement your retirement. Maybe there's rental income, so on and so forth. You know, that's where long-term care. Disability, no. Long-term care, yes.
Okay. How much do I actually need?
Well, that's a personal decision, right? It depends on how much do we want to mitigate the financial loss, right? How much do we want to bear personally? What sacrifice would my estate, the assets I have set aside, would it sacrifice my partner's or spouse's standard of living? You know, do I need to place a burden? Not that your family would feel this way, but a financial stress on your family members or friends if you needed to ask for assistance. Do you want to have the best option possible in terms of your care? I think you're going to be looking at, you know, higher cost policies. So again, that's a bit of a personal decision, but that's one definitely we can sit down and kind of explore with you to help wrap your mind around what that cost could be and what you can afford.
Okay. One of our viewers wants to know, can I just pay for my care out of pocket?
You can, but just keep in mind, absolutely nothing wrong with that. But we have to decide at that particular point, how long, how much would that draw down the assets that I have for the surviving spouse or partner to have their own quality of life that maybe we don't want sacrificed? Do we have an estate, assets that we want to pass on to the children, the grandchildren, so on and so forth? Remember, I gave that example of maybe a family home. We don't want to necessarily sacrifice that. We want the future generations to enjoy what we enjoyed when we grew up there or spent time there. So that's absolutely an option. Nothing wrong with it. I often think maybe a way to think about it is maybe it's not the Cadillac plan. Maybe you self-insure some. Maybe you buy a policy to mitigate a portion, right? Now, again, that has to be your personal preference. It's got to meet your goals and objectives, but that could be one way to think of it. It's not black and white.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Graham. That's very valuable information. And thank you to all of our viewers for joining us today. Just as a reminder to you all, we do keep all of our current information, articles, events, etc., on our social media pages as well as our website. So please check regularly to stay on top of all the latest and greatest information that we do have to offer. And also just want to say thanks again for joining us. Hope everyone has a great afternoon and a very healthy, happy, safe holiday weekend. We will be closed on Monday for Labor Day, but back at it on Tuesday. So we'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday on our weekly wrap up and again next month for our webinar. Thanks so much.
Take care.